I'd like to tell you about my uncle on my mother's side of the family. This particular uncle was an entrepreneur and the quintessential salesman. During that time, up and down the Appalachians between Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, there was a number of coal mining camps. And my uncle sold shoes, clothing, and he was a photographer, but he only took portraits. And I can remember my uncle had one of those large boxy cameras, the kind that when he took a photograph, he would get under a black curtain behind the camera, and he would slide these plates in that contained the film. He lived with my grandmother, and out at the side of the house they had a building that they called a smokehouse at that time. And the first time that I really became aware of my uncle was over 60 years ago. And one day when we were down there, he said, "I want to show you some magic." And I went out there in the smokehouse with him, and he took what I thought was just a regular piece of paper and put it in what I thought was regular water. And before my eyes, I saw an image of a lady appear on that paper. And I thought that was the most fantastic thing that I had ever seen in my life. Even today, when I go into a Cracker Barrel, especially if it's in and around Appalachia, I will look at a photograph hanging on the wall, and I'll think, could that be a photograph that my uncle took? Because a lot of the photographs that I see looks exactly like the photographs that he was doing. And at that time, he was not using color film, and he had these ladies who were real good with a paintbrush to turn these photographs into color photographs. And you've seen them on the walls of Cracker Barrels. Well, that's the type of photographs he took. But anyway, in his pursuit of the photographs, which he was extremely successful at that, he was continuously going up and down Appalachia to the mining camps. And also, when I would go over to my grandmother's house, the house was full of ceramic figurines, gaudy things, brightly colored, and most of them had clocks inside of them. And at that time, if you went into a mining camp, each mining camp had what they called a commissary. And when you would go into the commissary, behind the counter on a shelf, you would see these gaudy-looking, I don't even know how to describe them, but if you're as old as me, you've seen them. Like elephants painted in all kinds of bright, iridescent colors with a clock embedded in its side. And what these were, and also shotguns everywhere. And what these were, they were prizes that you could win off of punchboards. Now, if you're not familiar with a punchboard was similar to a slot machine in the fact that the paper that you punched out usually had lemons, bells, and things like that on it. And if you punched out a piece of paper that had, say, like 3 bells, you may win a shotgun. Well, my uncle had tons of that stuff in my grandmother's house. He had all kinds of shotguns and gaudy figurines. And it was a fascinating thing to see. And what my uncle did is when he was traveling around these mining camps taking photographs, he would always stop into the commissary. They called these places commissaries because you could go in there and they had groceries. Some of them even had theaters and pool tables and restaurants. And he would go into these commissaries, and he would always go up to the punch board, and he would purchase, I think it was like a nickel a punch on some, and some were 10 cents a punch. So he would punch a few out, and the patrons that came before him, when they punched their punch those pieces of paper out, if they were not a winner, they'd just leave them laying on the counter. And before my uncle would leave, he would scoop up all of those pieces of paper. They had listed on a board behind the counter what combination you had to have to win. So what he would do is he would go back home to my grandmother's house, and he had perfected a way to shave those images off of those pieces of paper, and he could counterfeit the winning piece of paper. And I had been told by some of the family members that he was so good at it you couldn't even tell it from the original piece of paper. So once he had his counterfeit winning piece of paper for the punch board, he would go back to the commissary, and he would purchase, he would have the winner, he would have the winning piece of paper hidden within his fingers. So he would go in and he'd say, well, I'm going to punch 5. And he'd punch 4, and on the 5th one he would punch it through an empty hole. Of course, it took a brave man to do this back in those days. So he would be a winner, and he would win either a shotgun or whatever. And he was, winning at all of these punch boards in these mining camps. Well, they knew that somebody was cheating these punch boards, so most of the proprietors of the mining camp got together to try to flush the culprit out. Well, they flushed the culprit out, which was my uncle. So the sheriff, they called them high sheriffs back then, arrested him, took him to jail. And back then they could just practically put you in jail and keep you as long as they wanted to. And of course judges then had probably even more power than they have today. So anyway, they arrested my uncle. And when he came before the judge said, well, what's the problem here? And they said, well, Judge, this is the guy who's cheating all those punch boards, blah-de-blah. So anyway, the judge listened to it, and he asked my uncle, he said, is this the truth? And he said, yes, Your Honor, it's the truth. And he said, well, I tell you what, son, he said, I hate punch boards. He said, that's just gambling. That's all that is. And he said, if you're cheating punch boards, he says, I know some of these punch boards are rigged until no one can win. So all you're doing is cheating the cheaters. And you have my permission to go to any mining camp within my jurisdiction, and if you can cheat a punch board, you cheated. Well, you know what happened. The word got around, and they knew who my uncle was, and when he came into the mining camp to take his photographs, and he came into the commissary, there is no way that they would let him try to win anything on their punch boards. So anyway, that's the way a judge gave my uncle the permission to be a counterfeiter and a cheat. Thank you very much for listening to that story. We'll see you. Bye-bye. Thank you.